In just 47 minutes, Jasmine Crockett turned a late-night talk show into a battleground for healthcare justice. She confronted a system live on air, a system that decides who lives and who dies, not based on need, but on race and income. Millions of Americans watched as Jimmy Kimmel was forced to rethink everything he thought he knew. But here's the question. Can one televised reckoning really change decades of brutal inequality? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The set of Jimmy Kimmel Live glowed under the weight of golden and blue spotlights, the stage polished to a mirror sheen, every camera humming softly as it broadcast live to millions of homes. Every seat in the audience was filled to capacity. Men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, laughing, clapping, leaning forward in their chairs, riding the comfortable wave of late-night humor. Jimmy Kimmel, with his familiar, easygoing grin and rolled-up sleeves, tossed out clever jokes about the absurdities of American healthcare. $800 aspirin bills, endless hold music on insurance hotlines, and doctors who couldn't explain their own invoices. The crowd erupted in laughter. A little too loud, a little too eager, like people laughing to keep something darker at bay. On the far side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her face an unreadable mask, her eyes following every move with the quiet precision of someone who knew. The real conversation hadn't started yet. Around her, the panel of healthcare advocates exchanged wary glances, the kind of glances soldiers give each other before stepping into no man's land. The cameras panned across the smiling faces in the crowd, but not even the most polished editing could hide the growing tension coiling at the edges of the room. Jimmy, sensing the subtle shift, let the laughter trail off naturally. Before leaning forward on his desk, the corners of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. The studio lights seemed a little harsher now, as if magnifying the truth about to break through the carefully crafted entertainment. "You know," he began, his voice dropping to a quieter, heavier tone that immediately pulled the audience closer. "It's all funny, until it's not." A different kind of silence fell, a silence full of breath held too long, of hearts tightening in anticipation. Jimmy's hands, normally animated and expressive, stilled as he spoke about the night his son Billy was born. The machines, the alarms, the sterile panic of hospital corridors. His words weren't polished. They stumbled out, rough and cracked at the edges, making them land all the harder. "When the doctor told us Billy's heart wasn't right, I have never been so scared in my life. Nothing prepares you for that moment." He paused, swallowing against the lump in his throat. And in that pause, the room seemed to shrink around him. "It's not just fear," he continued, voice hoarse now. "It's this helpless, gnawing terror, knowing that even if you'd give up everything you own, every dollar, every breath, it might not be enough. Because in this country, saving your child isn't just about medicine. It's about money." Some members of the audience lowered their eyes. Others gripped the arms of their chairs tighter, the reality too sharp to look at directly. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat frozen in place, the storm rising silently behind her calm expression. Because she knew, had always known, that for millions of families who didn't have fame or fortune or public sympathy, there was no doctor rushing into the room, no camera crew ready to amplify their cries for help. The truth Jimmy had revealed cracked the surface of the room. But what came next hit with the force of an avalanche. The grief, yes, but now sharpened into fury. Jimmy sat a little closer to the edge of his chair, no longer the polished host, but a father stripped down to something raw and real. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, fingers digging into the wood as he launched into the next chapter of his story. The chapter too messy for polite headlines. He spoke of the endless, frantic calls to hospitals across the country, his voice catching as he remembered the way polite voices on the other end would stiffen the moment insurance was mentioned. "I didn't care where the hospital was. I didn't care how far we had to go. I just wanted someone, anyone, to say they would help him," Jimmy said, his voice thick and cracking. But all they cared about was whether we had the right paperwork, the right numbers in the right boxes. The studio lights seemed to dim as his words filled the space. And somewhere deep in the audience, the murmurs of shifting bodies began. People struggling with the realization that for all their laughter, this story wasn't entertainment, it was indictment. Jimmy's face hardened as he described sitting up all night with a phone in one hand and a credit card in the other, ready to buy his son's life if that's what it took. "We were lucky," he said bitterly, the words spitting from his mouth like a curse. "We had a platform. We had people who cared enough to listen. But what about the families who don't?" His voice rose, cutting deeper, no longer hiding the anger that had been brewing beneath the grief. "What about the father who works 2 jobs and still gets told, 'I'm sorry, your insurance doesn't cover this surgery'? Where's the help for him?" Jimmy's face twisted in something close to rage as he stabbed his finger into the desk for emphasis. "Politicians are happy to stand in front of a hospital with a giant pair of scissors and smile for the cameras. They love to talk about family values when it's convenient. But when my son needed a miracle, and I needed them to actually do something, where were they?" His voice echoed in the stunned silence, the words crashing against the walls like a battering ram. The audience sat frozen, caught between guilt and helplessness, as if Jimmy's fury had peeled back some ugly truth they could no longer pretend not to see. Jimmy's anger still rang through the studio like the echo of a struck bell. But across from him, in the gathering silence, another force was quietly building. A storm with a different kind of fury. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen at first, her posture composed, her face a portrait of impassive calm. But beneath the stillness, something shifted, subtle and seismic. Her right hand tightened on the smooth armrest of the guest chair, the skin at her knuckles blanching white for just a moment before she forced it to relax. Her breathing slowed deliberately, controlled and deep. Not the panicked gasps of someone blindsided, but the steady inhalations of a fighter who had been waiting for the bell to ring. The camera, almost sensing the shift, drifted closer, catching the faint tightening around her mouth and the razor-sharp focus in her eyes. Those eyes, cool, steady, unwavering, locked onto Jimmy, not with resentment, but with a weight that seemed almost unbearable. To the casual viewer, she looked unshaken. To anyone who understood real power, it was clear. She was drawing a line inside herself, preparing for war. In that moment, Jasmine didn't need to speak. Her silence screamed across the studio louder than any speech, louder than any applause. Slowly, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, and the energy in the room shifted so violently it was as if the earth itself had tilted beneath the stage. It was not the hurried, fumbling rise of someone eager to interrupt. It was something calculated, something ancient. A force gathering its full strength before striking. The subtle scrape of her chair against the glossy floor seemed to echo off every hard surface in the studio, louder than it should have been, making every head snap toward her as if pulled by an invisible thread. Jimmy Kimmel's mouth faltered open slightly, confusion flickering across his face. The easy rhythms of the talk show shattered without warning. Jasmine straightened to her full height, the lights glinting sharply off her polished suit, throwing clean, hard lines across her shoulders and face. Her hands, once loosely resting in her lap, now hung at her sides, like the silent thread of a blade yet to be drawn. Her eyes, cool, steady, ferociously alive, locked onto Jimmy's with a gaze so powerful, so unflinching, that it sucked the last nervous energy from the audience and replaced it with pure, electrified stillness. To the cameras, she looked poised, composed. But to anyone truly watching, it was clear. She was no longer waiting for permission to speak. She allowed the weight of her standing presence to fill the room first, owning the space, commanding the silence like a general commanding an army. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried with the gravity of something undeniable. "Your pain is real," Jasmine said, each word striking with the precision of a drumbeat inside a funeral procession. "No one here will ever question the fear, the helplessness you felt." She paused, not to collect herself, but to make sure every eye, every mind, was locked onto hers, unable to escape the truth coming next. She took a single step forward, not hurried, not tentative, but measured, each footfall reverberating through the bones of everyone watching. "But don't you dare," she continued, her voice deepening, her tone sharpening like a sword being drawn across stone. "Don't you dare use your tragedy to erase the lives of those who never even got the chance to beg for help." Another heartbeat of silence. "Don't turn your story into a wall that shuts out the screams of those this system was built to ignore." The words did not land softly. They struck the studio like a hail of hammer blows, scattering the last illusions of comfort or safety among the stunned, frozen faces in the crowd. The room still trembled with the shock of Jasmine's words. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She had shattered the surface. Now she would show them what lived beneath it. Jasmine stood at the center of the stage, a dark silhouette framed by the brutal honesty she had unleashed, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need tears. When she spoke again, her tone was calm, eerily calm, the kind of cold, deliberate clarity that made the truth sharper, more painful. "I had a cousin," she began, her eyes never leaving Jimmy's, though her voice was now reaching past him to the millions beyond the camera lens. 17 years old, smart, funny, loved basketball, loved annoying his sisters, loved dreaming about the future he thought he had time to build. Her voice didn't quiver, didn't hesitate. It was clinical in its control, like a surgeon describing the facts of a fatal wound. "He had a heart murmur, nothing catastrophic, nothing urgent," they said, "if it was managed properly. But we didn't have insurance." The words dropped into the studio like stones into deep water, each one pulling the room further under. She shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but to anchor herself even more firmly where she stood. "So we waited," Jasmine continued, her voice as smooth and sharp as ice. "We waited for an appointment we couldn't afford, in a system that told us without saying it that his life was a line item too expensive to save." There was no dramatization, no appeal for pity. Her restraint made the horror even worse, each sentence landing like a silent hammer against the air. "He collapsed one night during practice, collapsed on a basketball court under a flickering gym light, gasping for air while a coach who couldn't afford a defibrillator tried to keep him alive." Her words painted the scene in brutal strokes. No embellishments, no tears, just reality in its most merciless form. "The ambulance took too long. The hospital turned us away at first because we couldn't prove we could pay. By the time someone finally decided he was worth saving, it was too late." The audience, which had moments ago been breathing in careful, even beats, now sat motionless. It wasn't just sadness. It was horror. It was complicity. Jasmine's voice did not rise, did not falter. 17 years old, she said again, almost softly this time. 17! Dead because healthcare in this country asks first for your insurance card and second for your symptoms. She did not wipe away tears. There were none. She did not bow her head or clasp her hands in some visible display of grief. She simply stood there, weaponized by the very thing that had tried to break her family and failed: the truth. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing her face in perfect, merciless detail. The set of her jaw, the calm storm in her eyes, the absolute refusal to let this moment pass as just another sad story. Jasmine let the silence that followed stretch until it became unbearable, until the audience squirmed, not from boredom, but from the pain of their own realization. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a design, a feature, not a flaw, of the system they had all accepted as normal. The studio, which had once crackled with the easy humor of late-night television, now felt more like a courtroom after a guilty verdict had been read aloud. Even Jimmy, who had spent years mastering the art of reclaiming a room with a joke, found himself paralyzed, trapped under the unbearable gravity Jasmine had summoned with nothing but her story, and the steely, ruthless honesty with which she told it. In the crowd, something shifted. Not a sound, not a cry. Something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. People leaned forward, not in curiosity, but in allegiance. They weren't just listening to Jasmine now. They were following her, being pulled into her orbit by the undeniable, searing truth that no joke, no wealth, no fame could shield them from forever. In that instant, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest on a talk show. She wasn't just a congresswoman or a lawyer. She was a mirror held up to the country, showing them everything they had tried not to see, and forcing them to look anyway. The cameras kept rolling, but the rules of television no longer applied. The applause signs stayed dark. No one dared to move. No one dared to even whisper, as if speaking would somehow desecrate the raw sanctity of what had just been laid bare before them. Jasmine didn't thank them for listening. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stood there, a woman who had weaponized her silence into a blade sharper than any rhetoric. Her cousin's name went unspoken, but his life, his stolen future, filled the room so completely that it felt as if he were standing there beside her, a silent witness to the indictment she had just delivered. And for the first time since the cameras had started rolling, the audience began to shift, not toward the easy practice sympathy of a celebrity's tragedy, but toward the harder, heavier realization of systemic betrayal. Toward her, toward the truth. The air inside the studio had turned dense, suffocating, as if everyone were bracing for a second impact they knew they couldn't escape. And when Jimmy shifted forward, it wasn't toward healing. It was toward a fight. Jimmy sat up sharply, his elbows planted firmly on the edge of the desk, his shoulders tense, every inch of him crackling with the stubborn anger of a man who had been hurt too deeply to surrender. His voice broke the heavy stillness like a whip crack. "I've seen death," he said, each word striking the air with the force of someone trying to anchor himself to a truth too painful to bear. His hand slammed lightly against the desk, a hollow sound that reverberated across the frozen studio. His face flushed, not with shame, but with the frantic, almost desperate need to be understood. Not as a celebrity, not as a host, but as a father. "You think I don't know pain?" Jimmy snapped, his voice rising against the rising tide of silence. "You think I haven't paid a price?" His chest heaved with the effort, his whole body leaning into the moment, willing the audience, willing Jasmine in to see the battlefield he had survived. But Jasmine did not flinch. She did not soften. She stood there, rooted in the truth of a pain even deeper than his. And when she answered, her voice carried the cold, merciless clarity of a blade slicing clean through the fog. "You understand personal pain," she said, and the steadiness of her voice made the contrast almost unbearable. "Like fire meeting the unmoving face of stone. But I understand systemic injustice, the kind that kills dreams before they're even born. The kind that decides, long before anyone gets sick, who deserves a second chance and who doesn't." She took one small step closer, her presence growing heavier with every word, her eyes never leaving his. "You fought one battle," she continued, her voice quieter now but even more devastating. "But millions of us are fighting wars every single day. Wars we were drafted into just by the accident of where we were born, how we look, how much money our parents had in their pockets." Each sentence fell like hammer blows in a courtroom with no possibility of appeal. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. No sharp retort, no clever deflection, only the raw, visible struggle of a man realizing he was standing on ground far shakier than he had ever admitted to himself. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he leaned back into his chair, the aggressive fire draining from his posture, as the weight of her truth bore down on him. The audience, who had moments earlier clung to every word of Jimmy's righteous anger, now shifted again. This time, not out of loyalty, but out of something older, something harder to shake: recognition. A single sharp exhale broke the silence, a rush of breath from somewhere deep in the crowd. Not loud, but unmistakable. The sound of a wall cracking. The sound of certainty giving way to something infinitely more dangerous. Doubt. The cameras, still rolling, caught every flicker of emotion. Jimmy's clenched jaw, the faint tremor in his hand, and the unstoppable rising tide in Jasmine's eyes that said without words, this fight was never about winning an argument. It was about revealing a truth no one wanted to see. Jimmy's silence still echoed across the studio, but Jasmine didn't rush to fill it. She let it burn. She let it hollow out the room, because the real blow hadn't even landed yet. With the same deliberate calm she had wielded all night, Jasmine reached for the folder resting on the table beside her. She didn't fumble. She didn't shuffle for effect. Every motion was clean, precise, almost surgical. She opened the folder and drew out a stack of papers, statistics, reports, government findings, and laid them flat before her, as if presenting evidence before a jury that could no longer claim ignorance. "Let's talk about facts," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. "Not emotions, not anecdotes. Facts!" The camera zoomed tighter, capturing the steady composure of her hands, the steel in her posture. She raised the first page, her voice steady and cold enough to make the hairs on the back of every neck in the room stand upright. African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from preventable diseases than white Americans. 3 times. Latino children are twice as likely to be uninsured compared to white children. Rural hospitals have been shutting down at a rate of nearly 1 per week because the profits aren't high enough to justify saving lives. She flipped the page with a crisp snap, each sound loud in the deathly quiet room, hammering reality into every corner of the studio. "The number one predictor of whether you'll survive a major illness in America," Jasmine said, "isn't the quality of your doctor. It isn't your willpower. It's your zip code." She let that sit for a moment, looking out into the blinding lights, the sea of faces barely breathing. You can work 2 jobs, pay your taxes, raise your children right, and still be condemned by a system that decided long ago that some lives are simply too expensive to save. Her hand hovered over the next page, but she didn't need it. The data was already burned into her bones. "And make no mistake," Jasmine added, her voice hardening even further, "these aren't numbers. These are names. These are faces. These are families sitting by hospital beds, praying to gods who sometimes answer, but more often are drowned out by the ring of a cash register." The audience didn't stir. They couldn't. The weight of what they were hearing pinned them in place. Every breath shallow, every heartbeat loud. Jimmy sat rigid in his chair, his hands folded tightly together, his gaze locked onto the surface of his desk, as if it could somehow shield him from the truth slicing the air around him. Jasmine took a slow step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor, with a finality that was almost funereal. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply stated, with a clarity that would be replayed for days across every television and social feed in America. "So I ask you, Jimmy," her voice dipped lower, colder, sharper. "I ask every person watching at home. I ask every politician who ever posed for a photo outside a hospital and called it progress." She let her gaze sweep across the cameras, pinning not just Jimmy, but the entire nation to the wall. "Is your child's life worth more than the life of a homeless child? Is your fear more valid than theirs because you had the money to be heard?" The silence after her question was not soft. It was shattering. It cracked the bright, polished facade of the talk show into 1,000 sharp pieces, exposing the raw truth beneath, that the system had never been about saving everyone. It had always been about deciding who was worth saving. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away. She stood in that silence and let it become her ally. The roar of everything unspoken crashing like thunder behind her calm exterior. She didn't need to explain the implications. She had ripped the veil away, and what remained could not be unseen. In that moment, she was no longer just a voice among many. She was the reckoning itself, standing unmoved in the center of a broken empire, pretending it was whole. The cameras continued to roll, but they captured something rare now, something raw, something undeniable. Not just the pain in Jimmy's clenched jaw, or the tears brimming in the eyes of scattered audience members. They captured the shift. The realization that this conversation was no longer about pity or celebrity or even politics. It was about survival, about justice, about the millions whose names would never trend on Twitter, but whose lives deserved to be fought for just as fiercely. And as Jasmine lowered the papers slowly back onto the table, her final act wasn't a dramatic gesture or a triumphant smile. It was a simple, searing silence. The silence of someone who had told the truth so thoroughly, so unflinchingly, that no one dared to speak against it. The question Jasmine had unleashed still hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield explosion, thick, choking, impossible to see through. And when the dust finally began to settle, all eyes turned, waiting for Jimmy to speak. For a long, excruciating moment, Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen, his fingers interlaced tightly on the desk before him, his shoulders tense under the crushing weight of a truth he could no longer dodge. The man who had built his career making millions laugh now found himself facing a silence so profound, it seemed to carve the very oxygen out of the room. The cameras stayed locked on his face, capturing the flicker of shame, the raw vulnerability that stripped away the last layers of his public armor. His lips parted once, then closed again, words floundering before they could form, as if he were wrestling something dark and furious inside himself. Jasmine didn't move. She stood exactly where she had planted herself, offering no lifeline, no softening glance, only the steady, unrelenting gaze of someone who had fought too long to allow easy exits. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked under shifting weight, the only sound amid the studio's crushing stillness. Jimmy's hand moved slightly, almost reflexively, as if reaching for a joke to toss out like a life preserver. But none came. He blinked once, swallowed hard, and when he finally spoke, his voice was nothing like the polished, confident cadence America knew. It was raw. It was real. "Maybe," Jimmy said, his voice cracking at the edges, "maybe I've been too focused on my own experience." The words, once released, seemed to flatten the room completely, as if the very act of saying them had pulled gravity tighter around everyone's chest. No music, no applause, no quick cut to commercial, just the sight of a man known for filling silence with humor, now standing naked inside it, fully exposed. Jimmy didn't rush to explain himself, didn't scramble to patch the fracture with a joke or a clever turn of phrase. His hands stayed still on the desk, his eyes damp but not yet spilling over, locked on to some invisible point beyond the camera lights, somewhere far beyond the safety of the stage. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. They seemed trapped inside the enormity of the moment, frozen between the man Jimmy had been a minute ago and the man he might still become. Even the technicians in the booth, hidden behind walls of screens and wires, hesitated with their fingers hovering over the next cue, unwilling to interrupt the raw, unscripted humanity unfolding live before the nation. Jasmine remained silent as well, her presence towering in its stillness, giving Jimmy no out, no distraction, no escape from the confrontation he had been forced to have with himself. It was not a moment built for television. It was too messy, too unscripted, too true. Jimmy inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling, like a man who had just surfaced after being underwater too long. "I thought," he said, voice softer, "that my pain, that what I lived through, gave me the whole story." He shook his head slightly as if hearing his own naivety for the first time. "But it didn't. It only gave me my story." The words weren't just confession, they were surrender, a slow, painful laying down of arms in a war he hadn't even realized he'd been waging against the truth. Across the vast room, small shifts in the audience finally stirred again. Not the restless fidgeting of discomfort, but the slow, careful movement of people rethinking everything they had been prepared to believe when they walked through the studio doors. They weren't watching a celebrity anymore. They were watching a reckoning. They were watching a man, stripped of all performance, forced to confront a reality so much larger, so much crueler than the world he had been living inside. Jimmy rubbed the back of his neck with one shaking hand, his mouth tightening against the surge of emotions threatening to break through. But he didn't look for the easy way out. He didn't laugh. He didn't deflect. And that, perhaps more than any admission he could have spoken, was what made the silence afterwards so deafening. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of a truth so heavy, so absolute, that the studio could no longer pretend it wasn't sitting right there between them. Jasmine didn't soften. She didn't rush to comfort him. She had seen too many apologies wilt into empty gestures when the lights faded. Instead, she simply stood there, patient, immovable, the storm after the fire, and let the moment carve itself into the bones of every person watching. No one applauded. No one cheered. The cameras stayed fixed, merciless and honest. And for the first time in what felt like hours, maybe longer, maybe forever, Jimmy Kimmel had nothing left to say. The heavy silence wrapped itself tighter around the studio, and for one long, suspended breath, it felt as if the entire world balanced on a single thread. And then, in the center of that fragile moment, Jasmine moved, not to condemn, but to offer something even more powerful. Jasmine stepped forward, her movements steady and unhurried, as if she had been waiting all night, not for victory, but for this exact reckoning. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolute, her face carved in sharp lines under the studio lights, her voice cutting through the charged air with the precision of a scalpel. "If you truly care," Jasmine said, each word ringing out across the room with undeniable force, "then don't just feel sorry. Don't just apologize." She took another step closer, standing now at the edge of Jimmy's desk, the distance between them a chasm bridged only by the truth that had been laid bare. "Help me," she said, her voice low but fiercely steady. "Help me fight for those who don't have the platform you have. Help me push forward the Healthcare Equity Act." There was no desperation in her offer, no begging. Only a simple, brutal demand for action, for partnership, for proof. For a split second, the cameras caught the flicker of emotion on Jimmy's face, the tremor of a man weighing not just his reputation, but his soul. And then he moved. Without hesitation, without theater, without any of the polished instincts that had once guided his every moment in front of a camera, Jimmy Kimmel stood and reached across the distance between them, his hand extended, open, unguarded, trembling slightly in the bright, merciless light. Jasmine didn't falter. She stepped forward and took his hand in hers, the two of them locked in a grip that was more than symbolic. It was seismic. The moment their hands met, a sound exploded across the studio. Not the carefully cued applause of a television audience, but something raw, something real, something that surged from the lungs of people who had just witnessed history claw itself into existence. Applause erupted like a thunderclap, rolling through the room in waves so powerful the cameras themselves seemed to shake. It wasn't the polite clapping of entertainment. It was the roar of human beings who had been forced to face a broken system, and now at last saw two people reaching across the divide to fight it. The camera operators, trained to follow action with precision, instinctively swung their lenses wider, capturing not just Jasmine and Jimmy, but the faces of the audience. Faces wet with tears, faces shining with something dangerously close to hope. A woman in the third row clutched the hand of the man beside her mouth covered by trembling fingers. A young man in the back wiped his eyes with his sleeve, his chest rising and falling in great shuddering breaths. Even the stagehands, normally invisible, stood frozen in the wings, their headsets forgotten around their necks, caught in the gravitational pull of a moment that no script, no producer could have ever planned. Jasmine squeezed Jimmy's hand once, firm, fierce, final, and then released it, stepping back just slightly but never breaking eye contact. There was no need for more words. The handshake had said everything. The fight would be hard. The system would not yield easily. But for the first time in what felt like an endless night, there was a sliver of light breaking through the cracks in the ceiling. Jimmy swallowed hard, his face still pale but determined, and turned slightly toward the audience, visibly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was rough, almost ragged at the edges. "Then let's do it," he said simply, and the roar of the crowd rose even higher, shaking the rafters, making the lights overhead tremble as if the building itself were straining to hold the force of their voices. The camera swung wide again, capturing every angle. The union of two hands across an impossible chasm, the faces transformed from numbness to defiant belief. The way the entire room seemed to pulse with a new, electric urgency. It wasn't polished. It wasn't clean. It was messy and real and heartbreaking and necessary. And somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the applause, beyond even the millions watching live at home, a different kind of noise began to build. A ripple of conversations, of debates, of demands that would not end when the credits rolled. Jasmine stood silently, letting the waves of noise crash over her without flinching. Her hands relaxed now at her sides, her chest lifting and falling slowly with the weight of everything she had carried to this moment. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was simply the first stone hurled against the wall. But it was enough. It was more than enough to shatter the silence that had suffocated too many for too long. Jimmy wiped at his face once with the back of his hand, the movement small, unguarded, and shockingly human. There was no script to follow now, no easy jokes to reclaim the safety of distance. There was only the raw, messy work ahead, the work of dismantling a system that had for too long placed price tags on human lives. And in that instant, under the merciless lights and the weight of a nation watching, Jimmy Kimmel didn't shrink from it. He stood there, shoulders square, eyes clear, facing the storm he had once tried to avoid. The studio lights glinted off Jasmine's cross pendant, a small but unmissable point of light amid the towering shadows. She tilted her head slightly toward Jimmy, a gesture so subtle most would miss it. But it was there. Acknowledgement, challenge, and warning all at once. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. And the road ahead would demand more than good intentions and handshakes. It would demand everything. The roar of the audience swelled again as the cameras continued rolling, drinking in the faces of hope, of anger, of determination. It caught the image of a mother clenching a photo of her son who hadn't survived. It caught the image of a nurse clapping with hands calloused from decades of overtime shifts in crumbling hospitals. It caught the image of a young girl watching from her father's shoulders, her small hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with something like awe. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved, a sentinel at the gateway between what was and what could be, her face calm, her heart a drumbeat against the false walls of a broken world. The last echoes of applause still thundered through the studio, but in the spaces between each beat, there was something even greater, something that couldn't be scripted, couldn't be staged, the feeling that something irreversible had just begun. The cameras slowed their frantic sweeping across the crowd, gradually tightening their focus, locking onto the two figures at the heart of it all. Jasmine Crockett and Jimmy Kimmel stood side by side, framed beneath the fierce, white-hot glare of the studio lights, the roar of thousands of hands colliding around them like a living ocean. Jasmine, tall and steady, her suit catching glints of the overhead spotlights with every slight shift of her shoulders, looked straight ahead, her expression composed but unyielding. Jimmy, still visibly shaken but standing firm, wiped once at the corner of his eye before lowering his hand slowly, as if even the smallest gesture carried the weight of a vow he had no right to take lightly. Between them, no words were exchanged, but none were needed. The image alone, the handshake that had passed, the truce that had collided, spoke louder than any speech ever could. They were not equals in their fight. Jasmine had carried the weight for far longer, had bled on battlefields Jimmy was only now glimpsing. But still, for this single moment, they stood together, and the sheer audacity of it made the room hum with energy too big to be contained. The applause didn't dwindle. It grew, rolling through the rows like a wave gathering force, driven not by entertainment, but by a collective need to witness, to acknowledge, to affirm what had just unfolded. Jasmine's eyes remained sharp, cutting through the sea of faces, not in triumph, but in solemn recognition. She had seen applause before, empty, performative, fleeting. But this was different. This was heavier, realer. She could feel it in her bones, in the slight tremble of the floor beneath her heels, in the churning thrum of hundreds of beating hearts aligned, for once, on the side of justice instead of comfort. Jimmy shifted once, glancing sideways at her, and though he said nothing, the look in his eyes, the quiet acceptance, the relinquishing of old ignorance, was louder than any declaration. Around them, the crew stayed frozen at their stations, unwilling to break the spell, their headsets forgotten, their carefully timed production schedules abandoned. Somewhere backstage, producers watched in stunned silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be replayed and remembered long after the evening's ratings were tallied. Jasmine lifted her chin slightly, not in pride but in defiance, a silent reminder to every viewer, every policymaker, every bystander. This was not the end. This was the first crack in a dam they had all pretended would hold forever. The lights above them pulsed slightly, the intense heat soaking into the fabric of their clothes, the sweat at their temples, but neither moved. They stood like monuments, two figures marked by different journeys, now briefly aligned by something bigger than either of their individual stories. Jasmine could feel the electricity in the air, sharp, biting, alive. It wasn't just admiration aimed at her, it was a demand, a summons. The people watching from the audience, from their living rooms, from their hospital beds and kitchen tables, were not applauding because a celebrity and a congresswoman had shared a moment. They were applauding because, for the first time in too long, someone had spoken a truth powerful enough to crack the marble mask of American healthcare wide open. Jimmy's shoulders sagged slightly, the exhaustion of the night finally beginning to settle into his bones. But he did not run. He did not retreat. He stood there beside her, even when every instinct of self-preservation must have screamed for him to find an easier way out. Jasmine didn't glance at him, didn't offer a comforting pat or a soft smile. She wasn't here to rescue him from the consequences of seeing clearly. She was here to show him, and everyone else, that seeing was just the beginning. Change was the price of clarity, and clarity was the debt they had all been too afraid to pay. The final camera shot tightened, the frame closing around them as the cheers rose to a crescendo, so deafening it seemed to shake the air itself. Jasmine's eyes never wavered. Jimmy's hands remained at his sides, open, vulnerable, human. No music played them off stage. No comedic skit buffered the moment. There was no curtain call, no closing monologue, no laugh track. Just the two of them illuminated in brutal, beautiful honesty, standing beneath a blaze of lights that felt less like a celebration and more like a trial by fire. And when the director finally reluctantly gave the signal to cut the feed, the screen didn't fade to black with laughter or applause. It froze for one heartbeat longer than protocol would normally allow, on the image of Jasmine and Jimmy standing shoulder to shoulder. No words, no slogans, just two people, bound not by victory, but by the shared, blood-raw acknowledgement that real justice demanded far more than any one night's applause could give. The sun rose heavy and red over Los Angeles, casting a bruised light across the city that had, for once, witnessed something it couldn't immediately package and sell. In the control room of Jimmy Kimmel Live, exhausted producers watched as the night's footage went viral faster than any comedy bit they had ever aired. By breakfast, the image of Jasmine Crockett and Jimmy Kimmel, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the unforgiving studio lights, was everywhere. The headlines came first, crashing through every news feed and social platform like a flood. An unlikely alliance, Kimmel and Crockett stand for healthcare equity. Justice on late night, Jasmine Crockett breaks the system open, from comedy to conscience, a night that changed everything. The video clips were even more powerful than the headlines. Viewers around the world watched as Jasmine's calm, relentless voice delivered truths most networks had spent years sidestepping. They watched Jimmy falter, stumble, and finally offer his hand, not in charity, but in surrender. The handshake was replayed in slow motion, set to soaring orchestral music in some edits, turned into a raw, unfiltered clip in others. Every angle was dissected, every glance analyzed. Social media predictably erupted into civil war. On one side, gratitude, celebration, awe. Thousands of messages flooded Jasmine's public page. Thank you for speaking for those of us who have no voice. You made me believe again. Healthcare isn't a privilege. You made them listen. On the other side, fury, Rage, the old, predictable venom of those who mistook comfort for truth. Comment sections filled with accusations. She ambushed him. Just another angry politician trying to make everything about race and class. If you don't like the system, leave. Death threats followed. Subtle at first, anonymous emails, vague warnings, but then louder, uglier. You'll regret what you did. You made powerful enemies tonight. By mid-morning, cable news vultures circled the story like bloodthirsty hawks. Some anchors praised Jasmine's courage. Others twisted her words, claiming she had bullied a grieving father, that she had weaponized sympathy for political gain. Pundits lined up to take sides, each one more desperate than the last to seize a piece of the firestorm before it burned itself out. Inside a modest, nondescript office in D.C., Jasmine sat alone, her back straight, her face impassive, watching the chaos unfold on a muted television screen. The morning news played silently across the wall, each Chiron more incendiary than the last. Hero or villain? Jasmine Crockett, the most dangerous woman on television. Her phone buzzed nonstop, calls from staffers, allies, journalists, opportunists. Aides begged her to clarify, to soften the message, to seize control of the narrative. Political advisors urged caution, whispering about polls, donations, re-election risks. Security consultants warned her to vary her travel routes, to avoid public events without private protection. Jasmine said nothing. She simply watched, the flickering images reflecting in her steady, unblinking eyes. Because she knew, this was not a mistake. This was not a scandal. This was the beginning. When her chief of staff finally burst through the door, papers in hand, face flushed with urgency, Jasmine barely glanced up. "They're coming after you," he said breathlessly. "Super PACs, lobbyists, media groups. You poked the beast." "I didn't poke it," Jasmine replied quietly. "I dragged it out into the daylight where everyone could see it." She turned off the television with a single click of the remote, plunging the room into silence except for the low hum of her phone vibrating across the desk. Message after message after message. Support, hatred, threats, invitations. The full cacophony of a country struggling to decide whether to crucify her or follow her. She opened her laptop, hands steady, and began typing. Not a retraction, not an apology, but the first draft of what she knew would come next. The Healthcare Equity Act wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a rallying cry. It had blood in its veins now. It had faces, names, histories. The nation had seen a glimpse of itself in the mirror Jasmine had held up, and now it had to choose whether to shatter the mirror or finally start cleaning up the reflection. Across the city, Jimmy Kimmel faced his own storm. The executives at ABC were nervous. Sponsors called with concerns. Lawyers whispered about contracts and public relations crises. But Jimmy, sitting alone in his office, replayed the moment again and again. The handshake, the roar of the crowd. Jasmine's voice slicing through the illusion he had once called truth. He knew deep down that Jasmine hadn't humiliated him. She had saved him from himself. Later that afternoon, a carefully worded statement appeared on Jimmy's official social media pages. "Last night was not about me. It was about listening, about learning, about standing for something bigger than all of us. I stand with Jasmine Crockett in the fight for healthcare justice." The statement caught fire. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo decades of imbalance. But it was a line in the sand, a promise to those who needed it most. This conversation wasn't going to end when the studio lights dimmed, but Jasmine knew better. She knew the attacks would keep coming. She knew that for every supporter who sent her a thank you message, 10 more were plotting to silence her. She sat back in her chair, closed her eyes for one long moment, and let the weight settle onto her shoulders like an old familiar coat. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Because movements were not built on applause. They were built in the fires of backlash, in the loneliness after the cheering stopped, in the relentless refusal to step down when the world demanded surrender. Outside her office window, the city moved on obliviously. Cars honking, people bustling, deals being struck and broken and forgotten in gleaming towers that scraped at the bleeding sky. But somewhere out there, in the hospitals, in the shelters, In the schools with broken heaters and empty cafeterias, someone was watching the news replay. Someone was whispering to themselves, maybe change really is possible. And Jasmine Crockett, warrior and witness, would be ready to lead them through the fire. Night fell over Washington, D.C., not with the lazy, glowing warmth of a city winding down, but with the cold, brittle finality of a battlefield settling into uneasy silence. The streets emptied into long stretches of shadow, broken only by the flickering of broken street lamps and the occasional ghostly hum of traffic. Somewhere behind her, in gleaming towers of glass and steel, deals were being struck to erase her name, to shrink her back into silence. Jasmine Crockett pulled the collar of her coat higher against the bite of the wind and stepped off the curb, alone, into the heart of the city she had spent her life fighting for. No cameras followed her now, no staffers hovered at her elbow. Her phone buzzed again and again in her pocket. Alerts, calls, desperate attempts to pull her back into the sanitized world of statements and optics. But she ignored it. Tonight was not about managing perception. Tonight was about remembering why she had started this war in the first place. Her boots struck the cracked sidewalk in steady rhythm, each step cutting through the stillness like a drum beat, a reminder that she was still moving forward, no matter how many forces would try to drive her back. She passed boarded-up clinics where too many had died, waiting for treatment that never came. She passed shuttered pharmacies where once mothers had begged strangers for antibiotics they couldn't afford. She passed schools whose broken windows and peeling paint told a story no State of the Union address would ever acknowledge. And through it all, she kept walking, the city's scars stitching themselves into the fabric of her resolve. At a rundown bus stop, an old woman hunched against the cold, her shopping bags gathered close around her like armor. Jasmine slowed, instinctively reaching into her pocket for cash, but the woman shook her head, her gaze fierce beneath the worn brim of her hat. "I saw you," she said, her voice rough with pride. "On the TV." Jasmine blinked, momentarily disarmed. The woman gave a thin, hard smile. "Don't you let them scare you, baby. Don't you dare." Jasmine nodded once, too choked for words, and kept walking. Blocks later, a group of teenagers in hoodies and battered sneakers clustered on a corner, their conversation falling into hushed awe as she approached. One of them, a boy no older than 16, stepped forward, awkward, unsure, but with a fire burning behind his eyes that Jasmine recognized immediately. "You made them listen," he said, voice cracking under the weight of what it meant to say it out loud. Jasmine smiled, not the polished public smile for cameras, but something raw and real and wounded. "Now it's your turn," she told him softly, and his friends erupted into clumsy applause as she disappeared into the night once more. Everywhere she looked, Jasmine saw the faces that Washington forgot, the immigrant mother rocking a crying baby on a park bench, too afraid of hospital bills to call an ambulance. The war veteran sleeping under a crumbling bridge, his medals sold long ago to pay for medication he could no longer afford. The child sitting on the stoop of a condemned building, clutching a toy with missing limbs. This was her battlefield. This had always been her battlefield. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't televised. It was long nights and broken promises and the stubborn, unyielding refusal to give up when everyone around you said it would be easier to surrender. She thought of her cousin, 17 years old, a future ripped away because a system decided he wasn't worth the paperwork. She thought of the parents who had called her office in tears, begging for help they should never have had to beg for. She thought of every story she carried like invisible scars beneath her skin, every life cut short, every injustice left to fester because fighting it had always seemed too costly for those in power. Jasmine stopped at the edge of a pedestrian bridge overlooking the city. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance, gleaming and hollow under the dark sky, like a monument to promises broken before they were ever made. She leaned against the railing, her fingers curling around the cold metal, the wind whipping her coat around her knees. Above her, the stars blinked dimly behind layers of smog and light pollution, a reminder that even in darkness, even buried by human failure, light could still find its way through. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cold burn through her lungs, letting the noise of the city fall away until there was only the steady hammer of her heartbeat. Not for applause, not for headlines, not even for revenge, for justice, for those who would never get a platform, for the lives no one else seemed willing to fight for. When she opened her eyes again, the city hadn't changed, but Jasmine Crockett had. She would face the death threats. She would face the smear campaigns. She would face the long, bitter grind of legislation dragged out and watered down and sabotaged at every turn. And she would win. Not because she was invincible, but because she refused to let them convince her that survival was enough. Because she refused to let another generation grow up believing that injustice was inevitable. Down on the street below, the city pulsed with life. Messy, cruel, beautiful life. Jasmine pushed away from the railing and started walking again, each step heavier than the last but no less certain. Tomorrow would be brutal. Tomorrow would be war. But tonight was the quiet before the battle, and she would meet it not with fear, but with the unbreakable resolve of someone who had already lost too much to ever retreat again. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, tucked her chin against the wind, and disappeared into the city she had sworn, long ago, to protect, even from itself. Because she knew one simple, searing truth. Let them build walls. She would become the hammer, and she would not stop until every last one of them came crashing down. The city swallowed Jasmine's silhouette into its restless veins, but even as the night closed in, the lesson she carried refused to be silenced. What she had fought for was bigger than a law, bigger than a handshake, bigger than any single victory. In the end, the fight Jasmine Crockett waged wasn't just against broken policies or corrupt institutions. It was against the deeper, more insidious belief that the world was unchangeable. That injustice was too large, too old, too ingrained to ever be defeated. She understood better than anyone that the true enemy wasn't simply bureaucracy. It was apathy. It was the seductive lie whispered to every broken heart that said, "This is just the way things are." Every child who died in a waiting room, every mother who wept over an unaffordable diagnosis, every worker who chose between groceries and insulin. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a sickness that had metastasized across generations. Jasmine had looked into the heart of that sickness, and she had refused to look away. But refusing was not enough. It was easy to stand in a studio flooded with applause and believe change had already arrived. It was far harder to stand alone on a freezing bridge at midnight and still believe it was worth fighting for. Jasmine knew the applause would fade, the news cycles would move on. The same forces that had built the machinery of inequity would rebuild it, repair it, disguise it in softer language and smiling faces. She knew her enemies were not the loudest voices shouting against her on television. They were the silent hands writing laws in backrooms, calculating precisely how much suffering could be tolerated before the public would notice. True injustice, she knew, was crafted in boardrooms, not shouted from podiums. It thrived not on outrage, but on exhaustion. It waited for good people to get tired, to sit down, to believe the lie that change was impossible because change was inconvenient. And that was the battle no one talked about, the slow, grinding war of attrition that wore down hope, not with violence, but with the simple, relentless erosion of belief. This was the battlefield where Jasmine had chosen to stand, because she had learned something most people never wanted to admit. Real change demands more than courage. It demands endurance. It demands the willingness to keep walking into rooms where you are hated, to keep telling truths that make people uncomfortable, to keep fighting battles you know you may never live long enough to see won. Justice in its truest form wasn't a trophy you held up for cameras. It was a lifetime of bleeding in small, invisible ways, and choosing to bleed again, and again, and again, because the alternative was worse. Jasmine's story wasn't about victory. It was about sacrifice. It was about the quiet, brutal, often thankless work of pushing a system millimeter by millimeter towards something closer to fairness. It was about planting seeds in soil poisoned by centuries of indifference and still believing they would grow. It was about knowing that you might never live to see the harvest and fighting anyway. Jasmine had stood under the lights, faced the fury of a broken world, and extended her hand not because she expected immediate redemption, but because she understood something deeper. Hope is not born in triumph. It is born in defiance. Hope is born when a woman looks at a system designed to erase her and says, "You will not." Hope is born when a father who thought he knew pain realizes that pain is not an excuse to stay blind. Hope is born when a nation watches a single voice refuse to be silenced and realizes it can no longer pretend not to hear. The true lesson of Jasmine's story was not that heroes win, it was that heroes endure. Heroes rise and rise again, bruised and battered, carrying not just their own burdens, but the invisible, crushing weight of those who cannot stand with them. Heroes are not created in moments of applause. They are forged in moments when no one is watching, when the cameras have turned away, when the crowds have gone home, when the cost of fighting seems too high, and they fight anyway. That is what Jasmine Crockett taught the world. That is what justice demands, and it demands it still. Tonight, somewhere in America, a family would sit in a dimly lit hospital room, praying not just for health, but for mercy from a system that calculated their worth in dollars and decimals. Tonight, somewhere in America, a young girl would hear that she couldn't afford to live. Tonight, somewhere in America, the lie would be told again, that survival is a privilege, not a right. But tonight, too, Jasmine Crockett walked the streets of that same America, carrying the stubborn, bleeding, unbreakable truth that no system could erase. Every life matters, not by virtue of wealth, not by virtue of fame, simply because it breathes. And that truth, once spoken, once fought for, once bled for, could never be fully silenced again. Not by politicians, not by billionaires, not even by the apathy that had killed more dreams than bullets ever could. As Jasmine disappeared once more into the restless city, 1,000 lights flickering around her like stubborn stars refusing to go out, she carried with her the quiet, terrible knowledge that real change would not come in a single night. It would come the only way it ever had. Step by broken step, battle by brutal battle, voice by trembling voice refusing to fall silent. And somewhere in 100 unseen places, people who had watched her stand unbroken would now find the strength to stand too. Because courage, once lit, is contagious. And once a single soul refuses to kneel, the ground itself remembers what it feels like to shake. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. After years of silence, Jasmine Crockett risked everything to reveal a Vatican secret buried across generations, a secret personally entrusted to her by Pope Francis. Over 50 million people watched live as she opened a letter that could destroy an entire empire. Betrayal, fear, and an unstoppable wave of truth. This was not just history unfolding, it was a reckoning waiting for centuries. But what hidden forces will rise to crush her before the light can break through? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights blazed in brilliant blue and white, casting long shadows across the black lacquer of the stage. While the audience buzzed, restless and expectant, the kind of excitement only late-night television could conjure, 1,000 grins half expecting another predictable evening of laughs and gossip. The MC, polished and eager, stepped into the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the most influential political figures of our time, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Applause erupted, scripted, automatic, a tidal wave of claps designed to sweep the night along. But then, the curtains parted and the room exhaled all at once. Jasmine stepped onto the stage, not with the buoyant stride of a media darling, but with a slow, deliberate weight, like a soldier returning from a battle no one else had fought. Her face was set, the corners of her mouth unmoving, her eyes burning with something far heavier than political ambition. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She moved with the gravity of someone carrying a truth too large for one lifetime. The MC extended his hand brightly, but Jasmine barely brushed it, her fingers cold and brief in the handshake. She moved to the guest chair with mechanical precision, every step a drumbeat of quiet defiance against the empty cheer around her. The audience, sensing something off, faltered, the applause petering out into an uneasy murmur. The cameras kept rolling. The lights stayed fixed. But the energy in the room fractured, as if everyone realized all at once that tonight would not unfold as expected. Jasmine sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap. And then, the spotlight caught something no one had noticed before. A small golden rosary resting on the table between her and the MC. It hadn't been there a moment ago. No one remembered seeing anyone place it. It gleamed against the dark wood like a silent witness, humming with a tension that made the very air seem brittle. And as Jasmine's eyes fell on it, something deep inside her seemed to lock into place, as if the entire night had been waiting for that single fateful second. And just like that, the atmosphere cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the way a dam groans before it gives way. The MC, still clinging to the routine, gave a tight laugh, bouncing slightly in his chair, tapping the cue cards against his knee like a man trying to restart a dead engine. "So, Jasmine," he said brightly, voice slicing the air like a butter knife against concrete, "you're everywhere these days. Making headlines, winning debates, America's new favorite powerhouse. Tell us, how do you juggle it all?" He winked playfully at the audience, coaxing them into a laugh that came a second too late, too thin, like the sputter of a car running out of gas. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her gaze was locked on the golden rosary on the table. Motionless, heavy, like a judge contemplating a verdict no one wanted to hear. The cameras stayed trained on her face, hoping for a smile, a wink, a witty retort, but nothing came. Only the long, unbearable silence of a woman measuring a choice so heavy it bent the air around her. The MC shifted in his seat, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a cough. "Maybe you've got a book deal coming? A podcast. Everyone's doing podcasts these days." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and a few polite chuckles stumbled from the audience, unsure if they were supposed to find this funny or terrifying. Still, Jasmine said nothing. Still, she stared at the rosary. Still, the pressure built, invisible but crushing, like the air just before a storm when the birds fall silent. The MC swallowed, wiping his hand subtly against his pant leg. He tried again, softer this time, desperate. "Jasmine, you okay?" His smile was faltering now, slipping into something smaller, something scared. And that's when Jasmine moved. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her eyes from the table. Her head rose, not fast, not dramatic, just a single movement, clean and precise, like the drawing of a sword from a scabbard. Her gaze found the MC, but it wasn't him she was really seeing. It was something beyond him, something none of them could understand yet. "Something coming." The room tensed on instinct. The laughter died entirely, as if every lung had forgotten how to breathe. And then she spoke, her voice low, rough-edged, carrying the raw gravity of a truth too long imprisoned. "I can't keep pretending anymore." The words struck like a blade into the heart of the set. The MC froze, mouth half open, a joke dying unfinished on his lips. The audience froze, every movement, every whisper, every fidget, falling into stunned stillness. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands curling into tight fists atop her knees. The golden rosary caught the light and burned between them like a fuse about to reach the powder. Her next words came quieter, but somehow heavier, sinking straight into the bone. "Tonight, there's something I have to say. No music, no applause, no polite segue to commercial. Only the terrible, yawning silence of a room realizing that it had stumbled, by accident or fate, into history. The silence inside the studio stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Jasmine sat forward slightly, her hands curled into each other on her lap, breathing steady, like someone lowering herself into deep, dangerous waters. She spoke again, but her voice had changed. It was softer, yes, but it carried a pressure now, like a tide building far below the surface. It was years ago. Her eyes unfocused, speaking almost to herself. "I had been moving from country to country, buried in endless reports, meetings that blurred into more meetings. Europe was supposed to be another stop, another faceless crowd, another speech no one would remember. She paused, her brow tightening, memory flickering like a flame behind her eyes. But that night, the world tilted. The audience leaned forward instinctively, as if the very air between them and her might break if they moved too fast. "I was staying in Florence," Jasmine continued, her hands now clasped tightly enough that her knuckles whitened. "An old hotel, beautiful in the way that only old sorrow can be beautiful. Stone walls, heavy wooden doors that swallowed sound. I remember the windows rattling slightly in the winter wind that night." She swallowed once, hard. "Around midnight, someone knocked on my door. Just once. Software. But it felt like it hit straight through me." Her hand moved unconsciously to her chest, as if remembering the sensation even now. "I waited for a voice, a second knock, anything, but there was only silence. The studio audience barely breathed. Even the studio lights seemed dimmer somehow, like the story itself was eating the brightness out of the room. When I opened the door," Jasmine said, her voice almost a whisper, "the hallway was empty, no footsteps, no sound, only an envelope lying flat against the floor. Thick paper, heavy, hand-pressed." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, reliving the chill that had rippled down her spine that night. There was no name, no address, nothing except one thing: the seal. Blood-red wax, stamped with a crest so old it looked like it belonged to another century. Her voice caught slightly before she forced it steady again. "It was the Vatican's crest." Another beat passed, thick enough to feel. "I told myself it was a mistake," she said, her lips tightening against the memory. "Some letter meant for someone else. Some prank by a drunk tourist. I told myself not to open it." Her eyes opened then, sharp and burning, dragging the audience deeper into her gravity. But something inside me, something deeper than fear or logic, whispered that I had to. She opened her palms slowly, miming the act of breaking the seal, her fingers trembling just enough for everyone to see it. "And when I did," she said, voice hollow, "inside there was no letter, no introduction, no instructions, only one sentence, handwritten, in black ink so faint it looked like it might vanish if you stared at it too long." She leaned closer, and when she spoke the words, it felt as if the entire studio contracted inward. "Walk with me under the olive trees. No cameras, no press." The phrase hung in the air. Simple, haunting, impossibly heavy. "For a full minute," Jasmine continued, a bitter smile flickering across her face, "I stood there, just staring at it, trying to convince myself it was nonsense, that I could crumple it up and forget it ever touched my hands." She paused, voice fraying at the edges, raw and human. "But some things," she said, "some things call you in a way you don't understand. Some truths choose you before you even realize you're part of them." She looked straight into the camera then, into the heart of everyone watching, and said, "And that night, I understood one thing more clearly than I ever had in my life." She let the silence thicken, sharpen, crush the space between them before finishing, her voice barely more than a breath. "I had to go." "And so I went," Jasmine thought, her voice threading low across the frozen silence of the studio. "And from the first step I took that night, I knew I was leaving something behind forever." The streets of Vatican City were unnaturally quiet, their marble bones cold under her shoes as she moved deeper into a maze of corridors few outsiders ever walked. The air smelled of old stone and something else. Something older, something like memory. At every turn, the towering walls seemed to press inward, as if trying to swallow her whole before she reached her destination. Jasmine didn't hesitate, not because she wasn't afraid, but because some fears are smaller than the terror of living a life spent looking away. She followed the directions given, each hallway more narrow, more deserted than the last, until finally a narrow archway yawned open, spilling her into a garden that felt untouched by time itself. It was colder here. The olive trees stood gnarled and skeletal, their roots knotted through the cracked earth like the fingers of the dead. Moonlight spilled in thin sheets across the garden, outlining every twisted branch in silver. The shadows were so deep they seemed almost alive, breathing, moving just at the edge of sight. Jasmine's breath formed small, ghostly clouds in the frozen air as she walked forward, her steps crunching softly against gravel, so old it might have once paved the feet of saints. And there he was. Pope Francis stood beneath the largest olive tree, the folds of his simple white robe almost swallowed by the night. He did not wear the gold, the jewels, the ornaments of his station, only the plain garments of a man who had nothing left to hide. His shoulders hunched forward slightly, as if the weight of unseen wars bowed him lower with every breath. His frame was thinner than the photographs, more fragile, and yet the light that burned in his eyes was impossibly fierce, refusing to dim against the vast, indifferent dark around them. He watched Jasmine approach without speaking, without moving, like a sentinel waiting at the edge of a battlefield already lost. Jasmine slowed, her own body stiffening against the cold, against the enormity of what was about to happen. There was no fanfare, no procession, no words of welcome, only the deep thrum of silence, heavy enough to crush lesser souls. When she finally stopped a few feet from him, the stillness between them grew so dense it felt physical, a wall of unsaid things that could suffocate if touched too carelessly. Pope Francis looked at her, and for a long moment he said nothing. He only stared, into her, not at her, his gaze peeling back every layer of pretense, every shield, until all that was left was the raw, naked reality of two people meeting across a chasm that could not be crossed by titles or rituals. His face, lined and worn, was a map of a lifetime spent fighting storms the world never saw. Then finally his voice came, low, cracked, human. "I have failed!" The words didn't ring out. They didn't demand. They simply fell, like stones slipping from the hands of a man too tired to hold them anymore. "I have failed to protect the faith," he continued, his hands hanging limp at his sides, "from those who twist it, from those who trade it for gold and power." He shook his head slowly, the sorrow in him so vast it seemed to warp the air itself. "There are wolves among us, wolves who wear the skin of angels, and they have turned the house of God into a marketplace." The olive branches overhead rustled in a wind that felt colder than death, but neither Jasmine nor Pope Francis moved, because some truths were too heavy to outrun. The weight of his confession still burned in the cold air between them, and Jasmine realized then, with terrible clarity, that the truth wasn't just meant to be spoken. It was meant to be passed on, carried forward by those brave enough not to look away. Slowly, painfully, Pope Francis shifted his hands within the folds of his simple robe. His fingers, thin and vein like the roots of an ancient tree, searched for something hidden deep against his chest, something precious enough to guard with his final strength. Jasmine watched, unable to move, as he withdrew a single envelope, thick, heavy, the color of old parchment, aged by hands that had held too much sorrow. Its seal, a deep crimson disk of wax, bore the Vatican's ancient insignia, pressed with a finality that made it look almost like a wound. He cupped the envelope in both palms for a moment, staring down at it, as if saying goodbye to something he had fought to protect longer than anyone would ever know. Then slowly, he extended it toward her. The gesture was small, almost trembling, but it felt like the entire garden tilted around it, as if the earth itself leaned closer to witness the moment. Jasmine reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his. The envelope was cold, colder than the night air, and heavier than its size should allow, as if inside it lived not just words, but the ruins of battles fought and lost behind marble walls. Her hand closed around it carefully, reverently, like a soldier accepting orders she knew might one day cost her everything. And for a long moment, Pope Francis simply looked at her, into her, with an intensity so raw it made her heart clench painfully inside her chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a pope addressing the world. It was the voice of an old man, tired, bruised by wars fought in silence, pleading not for himself but for something far greater. "If I do not have the chance, you must be the one to open the truth." The words didn't shout. They didn't echo. They sank. They embedded themselves into Jasmine's spine, her lungs, her bloodstream, branding her with a duty she hadn't asked for, but could no longer refuse. She clutched the envelope tighter against her chest, feeling the cold seep into her skin, feeling the enormity of what it meant seep into her soul. Around them, the olive trees swayed and groaned under the winter wind, their old limbs scratching against each other like ancient bones, mourning things too old to name. Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, to promise him something, anything, but no words came. Some silences are too sacred for words. The envelope still weighed heavily in Jasmine's hand. But what truly anchored her in place was the realization dawning quietly, relentlessly inside her. She had not been chosen by chance. She had been chosen because there was no one else left. Pope Francis's eyes didn't waver, even as the cold night drew tighter around them. His voice was thin but sharp, cutting through the silence like a whispered sword. "I could not give this burden to those closest to me," he said, and there was no anger in his tone, only a hollow, exhausted grief. "They have built walls around themselves so thick with pride, fear, and ambition that no truth can pass through them anymore. They dress in silk and gold. They speak of the poor but dine with kings. Their prayers are loud, but their hearts are quiet when they should be screaming." His hands folded before him, trembled not from weakness, but from the unbearable knowledge of betrayal. Jasmine swallowed, her throat dry and raw, the reality of his words hitting her harder than the winter wind. "I needed someone untouched by these walls," he continued, his voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorial, as if the shadows themselves were listening. "Someone who has not been fed by the system. Someone they would underestimate, dismiss, never see coming." He let the words settle between them like stones sinking into deep water. You are that someone." The weight of his gaze pinned her to the ground more surely than any chain ever could. "You are not bound by their false oaths. You are not poisoned by their crowns." His voice cracked then, only once, the break so small most would miss it. But Jasmine heard it, felt it, like a fissure running through the night. "And that," he finished, almost whispering now, "is why you can do what none of them will." The garden seemed to press closer around them, as if the very stones and trees bore witness to the passing of something sacred, something irreversible. And in that frozen breath of time, Jasmine understood. She was no longer merely a visitor. She was a weapon, and the truth she now carried was sharp enough to cut through even the thickest walls of silence. But the truth was never meant to sit quietly, and neither, it seemed, were those determined to bury it before she ever found the courage to set it free. The night she walked away from that hidden Vatican garden, Jasmine thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. In the days that followed, she wrapped the envelope in a layer of old legal files, slid it into a false bottom drawer, and told herself it could wait. She buried it the way some bury grief, quietly, methodically, without ever quite believing it would stay buried. She told herself she was being rational, that whatever was inside could not be more important than the life she had built, the safety she had earned. But the envelope never stopped breathing under the surface of her days. She could feel it sometimes at night, through the walls of her apartment, a faint pulse, like something alive scratching from inside a coffin. She had not broken the seal, but somehow the world already knew she carried it, and the world had begun to react. The changes came slowly at first. Little things, small enough to ignore. A locked laptop left untouched overnight flickered with ghost emails by morning. Conversations on secured phone lines crackled with static, dropping into dead air whenever she said words like Rome or Vatican. Once, at a crowded cafe, she caught the glint of a camera lens behind a newspaper, aimed straight at her chest. And though she told herself it was nothing, she began to notice other patterns. The same black car idling at the curb for hours, a face she recognized from the courthouse hallway suddenly appearing at her gym, her grocery store, her church. Paranoia, she whispered to herself. Only paranoia. Until the first letter arrived. It was tucked between her electricity bill and a flyer for a pizza shop that had been closed for 6 months. No stamp, no handwriting, just a single sheet of paper, typed in cold, clinical font. Silence protects more than you know. Jasmine stared at the words until they blurred, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that left her dizzy. She told no one. She shredded the letter and burned the shreds in her kitchen sink, watching the flames eat the warning letter by letter. But 2 weeks later, another came, and then another, and another. The letters never changed. The message never softened. Silence protects more than you know. But it wasn't just the letters. People she trusted, people who knew too much, began to vanish like smoke through cracked doors. One by one, their names stopped appearing in news feeds. Their phones stopped ringing. A junior journalist who once joked about her Vatican secrets was found drowned in a river she had no reason to cross. A friend who had driven her home from the airport disappeared without explanation. His apartment left untouched, the coffee still warm on the counter. By the third letter, Jasmine no longer slept through the night. By the fifth, she stopped believing in coincidences. And by the seventh, she understood with terrifying clarity. Whatever hunted her now would not be satisfied with silence forever. She had carried the silence like a second skin, worn it until it bled into her bones. But sitting here now, under the suffocating blaze of studio lights, with the entire world watching, Jasmine Crockett knew. Some silences were meant to be broken, even if it cost everything. The chair beneath her felt harder than steel, the air thicker, almost syrupy in her lungs as she slid her hand slowly inside her jacket. The MC was still talking, nervous, bright, desperate, but his voice had become little more than a mosquito buzz at the edge of her hearing. Her fingers closed around the familiar weight buried deep inside the folds of cloth, and her pulse spiked so hard she could feel it echo in her teeth. The envelope was warm now, worn soft by years of friction against her life. The red wax seal cracked at one edge, but still holding, like a dam refusing to break. She pulled it free with a deliberate, almost reverent slowness, placing it onto the polished oak table between them as if laying down a weapon. For a moment, the MC froze mid-sentence, blinking at the sudden intrusion of something unscripted, something too real for the soft, plastic world of late-night television. The cameras, trained and hungry, pushed forward mechanically, zooming in until the battered envelope nearly filled the nation's screens. The audience shifted, a ripple of bodies pulled by a tide they couldn't see, but could already feel pulling at their ribs. Jasmine lifted her head, her dark eyes locking not on the man across from her, but directly into the cold lens of the main camera, the portal between her and millions. Her voice broke the silence like a match dropped into dry brush. If not now, then it will never happen. The words didn't echo. They detonated, quiet but final, severing the night neatly in two. Jasmine's hand moved to the wax seal, her thumb pressed against the brittle surface, and the crack that echoed across the set was so sharp, so absolute, that a few members of the audience physically flinched. She peeled the flap back with the steady care of someone disarming a bomb, each movement slow, precise, irreversible. The paper inside was stiff, yellowed, trembling faintly under her touch. Not from the drafty studio air, but from the charge built up around it, from the years of fear, the years of silence, the years of unseen hands fighting to keep it buried. The MC sat rigid now, his hands clenched uselessly around his cue cards, color draining from his face as if he could feel, instinctively, that the ground beneath them was no longer safe. And in that moment, as Jasmine unfolded the letter for all the world to see, the artificial world of late-night TV, with its polished jokes and hollow applause, crumbled into dust around her feet. The first page was stark, no introduction, no preamble, no gentle descent into what was to come. Just a title typed in faded black ink, its weight sinking into Jasmine's chest like a leaden fist. Operative financial ties and asset misappropriation. Internal church documentation. She blinked once, her throat tightening, but forced herself to keep reading. Below the heading sprawled rows upon rows of names, names she recognized, names the world revered. Cardinals, bishops, administrators, all neatly listed beside account numbers, offshore companies, coded transactions stretching from Zurich to the Cayman Islands. The audience, watching from behind the invisible wall of broadcast screens, couldn't see the details yet, but they could feel it, the crackling energy of revelation ripping the sterile air apart. Jasmine turned the page with a hand that no longer trembled, her movements slow, methodical, as if each word needed to be carved into the bones of everyone watching. The next page drilled deeper, specific properties tied to phantom charities, luxury villas registered under papal organizations, entire hospital networks siphoning funds meant for the sick into anonymous holding companies. Jasmine's eyes scanned the documents, and with every line, the enormity of the betrayal gnawed deeper into her. These weren't just isolated scandals. This was a machine, a network hidden inside the very structure sworn to protect faith, hollowing it out from the inside like rot behind gilded walls. Every transaction was precise, calculated, protected by the armor of ritual and reputation, and every name carried the unbearable weight of trust broken beyond repair. There were no denials here, no gray areas left to argue over, only numbers, only signatures, only the slow bleeding out of a sacred institution into the cold, hungry hands of those who had long since abandoned their souls for ledgers. Jasmine could hear the tension now, palpable even through the studio's soundproofed walls, the sharp inhalations of the audience, the shifting of bodies too stunned to pretend this was just entertainment anymore. The MC sat frozen, his hands limp in his lap, eyes darting helplessly to the producers off stage, who themselves sat paralyzed, knowing there was no way to cut to commercial without revealing what they had allowed to be unleashed live. Jasmine pressed forward, flipping to the next page, revealing not just financial decay, but the political web protecting it. Memos, internal Vatican communications, personal correspondences, coded with euphemisms so thin they barely disguise the transactions underneath. Deals brokered with governments, silence purchased from media outlets, promotions awarded in exchange for loyalty to a system rotting under its own weight. And then she found it, the page that stopped even her breath cold, typed at the bottom of a classified memo, in a different, almost hurried hand, was a single line. It was not a transaction. It was not an accusation. It was a prophecy. The destroyer will not come bearing weapons, it read. They will come as a friend, clothed in light, but carrying the void. Jasmine stared at the words, feeling the cold knot of understanding tighten in her stomach. This had never been about a single scandal, a single betrayal. This had been foretold, anticipated, feared. Somewhere within the marble corridors and golden halls, they had known. They had known that the death of faith wouldn't come through violence. It would come through seduction, through imitation, through those who smiled and prayed and shook hands, all the while emptying the soul of everything it was meant to protect. She raised her head slowly, the paper trembling faintly in her grip now, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the truth she held. Across the table, the MC was pale, sweat glistening at his temples despite the cold of the studio. Behind the cameras, a low, involuntary murmur rippled through the crew. Somewhere in the darkness of the audience, someone gasped audibly, unable to contain it any longer. Jasmine turned another page, revealing photographs stapled to the final section of the letter. Grainy images of villas bought with stolen donations, yachts registered under ghost charities, luxury cars gifted in the names of the poor. Attached to each image was a name, a title, a date, enough evidence to ignite a fire that even the highest walls of the Vatican could not smother. And still the last sheet of the letter remained. It was different from the others. Handwritten, hurried, the ink smudged in places as if penned under unbearable pressure. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I am gone." Jasmine's throat locked, her fingers curling tighter around the edges of the fragile paper. There are those who will tell you that to expose this truth is to destroy faith. They are wrong. Faith cannot be destroyed by the truth. It can only be destroyed by lies defended in silence. Each word cut deeper than the last, stripping away any lingering doubt, any last temptation to hide this nightmare back inside the darkness where it had been born. "Do not protect the walls," it ended. "Protect what the walls were built to shelter. Protect the flame, even if the temple burns." Jasmine lowered the letter slowly, her hands steady now, The audience dead silent, the world holding its breath. Jasmine let the last page of the letter settle onto the table, its weight filling the studio like a slow rising tide. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence thicken, let the audience feel the full gravity of what they had just witnessed. Then, with hands steady but eyes dark with a grief too old to name, she reached inside her jacket once more. From a slim inner pocket, she withdrew a single photograph, its corners bent and worn, its surface scuffed by countless nights of being handled and hidden and re-examined under trembling hands. The camera zoomed instinctively, as if sensing something unspeakable was about to cross the line between the unseen and the unforgettable. Jasmine placed the photograph face down on the table for a moment, her fingers lingering atop it, as if weighing whether to flip it, whether to cross a second threshold from which there would be no return. Her voice, when it finally broke the stillness, was low, almost reverent. "There's something else," she said, "something that never made sense until now." She turned the photograph over with a soft, deliberate movement, revealing the image to the world. Under the dim, grainy resolution of a nighttime shot, two figures could be seen walking side by side. Jasmine and Pope Francis, unmistakable despite the blurring fog of the lens. They were alone, or so they had believed. The olive trees arched above them like cathedral rafters, the moonlight barely enough to sketch their outlines against the heavy dark. But in the far corner of the frame, almost swallowed by the shadows, lurked a third shape, a figure half-shrouded in a long, hooded cloak, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching. The audience audibly shifted, the collective sound of 1,000 heartbeats catching at once. The MC's face drained of color. Even the studio lights seemed to flicker, as if recoiling from the ghost now made visible on the screen. "This," Jasmine said, tapping the photo lightly with one fingertip, "was taken that night in the Vatican Gardens. The night Pope Francis entrusted me with the envelope." Her hand trembled once, just once, but she pressed on. "I didn't know this photo even existed until it arrived anonymously in my mailbox. A year later. No note, no sender, just this." She paused, letting the image burn itself into every mind watching. Then she said the words that chilled even the cameras to stillness. "And that wasn't the last time." She pulled a thin folder from under the table, a folder she had hidden there before the show began, unsure whether she would have the strength to reveal it. She laid it flat, flipping it open to reveal 3 more photographs, each one a different place, a different year. A political rally in Brussels, a conference hall in New York, a humanitarian summit in Nairobi. In each image, Jasmine stood at the center, surrounded by crowds, by light, by movement. And yet, in the distant, blurred edges of each frame, the same figure, the same hooded shadow, watching. "You see," Jasmine said, her voice gaining a hard edge now, "he didn't just warn me about corruption. He warned me about this." She drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the storm she had unleashed. "Pope Francis once told me, standing under those olive trees." Her voice dropped into a near whisper, but the microphone caught every word, broadcasting it into millions of living rooms, echoing across the silence of a world holding its breath. "You will see the shadow before you see the light." The words seemed to vibrate against the studio walls, sink into the foundations, reverberate into every bone of every person watching. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The photograph of the hooded figure stared back at them all, silent, immutable, real. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her chair, her body rigid, her face carved in something that was not quite fear, but not yet triumph either. "They've been following me for years," she said simply, "waiting, watching, making sure this moment never happened. And now, with the letter opened and the photographs laid bare, the silence that had once been her prison had become her weapon. The truth was no longer something hidden in dark gardens and sealed envelopes. It was alive. It had a face, and it had just been unleashed upon the world." The photographs lay like shattered mirrors across the table, and for a moment the world seemed suspended, holding its breath, trapped between everything it had believed and everything it could no longer deny. Jasmine Crockett understood then. This was not the end of a revelation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Jasmine rose from her chair with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands sliding away from the evidence spread before her, as if shedding a final chain. The studio lights caught the edge of her silhouette, framing her like a statue carved in the moment before battle. Every eye in the room followed her, wide and unblinking, as if afraid that even a blink might cause this fragile, terrible moment to vanish. The MC sat paralyzed, still clutching his useless cue cards, sweat glistening on his forehead, as if he too was a man who had realized too late that the rules of the game had changed, and that the old scripts would no longer save anyone. Jasmine stepped forward, the polished stage floor creaking faintly under her heels, every movement radiating an intensity so fierce that it seemed to scorch the very air around her. She stopped just shy of the front of the stage, turned to face the audience, and beyond them, the millions now glued to screens across the world. Her eyes burned, not with rage but with a clarity so sharp it felt almost violent. "Faith is not dead," she said, and her voice rang out not like a plea, but like a verdict carved into stone. "It has been buried." The words sliced through the stunned silence, leaving behind an aching space too wide for applause, too deep for denial. Jasmine stood tall, the edges of her presence cutting through the manufactured comfort of the studio like a blade through silk. Around her, the cameras continued to roll, silent witnesses to a history no one had planned to air, but now no one could escape. "And silence," she continued, her voice low but unbreakable, "is not surrender." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle into every corner of the room, into every spine sitting rigid under the pressure of realization. "Silence," she said, her gaze sweeping across them all like a floodlight scouring a battlefield, "is the battleground of those who still carry the light." The studio shuddered under the force of her words, as if the very walls had absorbed the truth and found themselves wanting. Jasmine took another step forward, the letter and photographs abandoned behind her like ashes of a world too corrupt to salvage. The MC shifted helplessly in his chair, the muscles of his jaw working soundlessly, his carefully managed world crumbling into pieces he could no longer fit back together. The audience remained frozen, not because they were indifferent, but because they knew, deep in the marrow of their bones, that something irreversible had been set into motion. Jasmine's eyes flickered once more toward the camera, the great unblinking eye that now carried her words into living rooms, into phones, into the hearts of those who had stopped believing that anything could truly change. She straightened her shoulders one final time, the fire in her gaze growing brighter, hotter, refusing to be extinguished. "The truth," she said, voice dropping into a near whisper that somehow felt louder than any shout, "is quieter than lies." The words settled like iron into the collective chest of the audience, heavy and permanent. But one day, Jasmine paused, her eyes flashing, daring the world to keep listening. "It will roar louder than them all." For a heartbeat longer, she stood there, a single figure against a backdrop too small to contain her. Then with a final, deliberate motion, Jasmine turned. She walked off the stage, not rushed, not fleeing, but with the slow, unbreakable gait of someone carrying a torch through a city already crumbling under the weight of its own betrayal. No music played, no applause rose, only the deep, stunned silence of a world realizing it had just been changed, whether it was ready or not. The letter, the photographs, the silent warnings, they remained behind her, abandoned on the table like remnants of a war that was only just beginning. But Jasmine Crockett no longer needed them. She had already become the message. And in the heart of that silence, for the first time in too long, truth began to breathe. The echo of Jasmine's final words still hung in the studio air, long after she disappeared backstage. A lingering tremor that no commercial break or scripted closing monologue could erase. For a heartbeat, the entire room, audience, crew, host, sat frozen in a stunned paralysis, caught between the fading pulse of the show's usual illusion and the raw violence of what had just been laid bare. The cameras continued to roll for several seconds longer, capturing blank stares, half-open mouths, cue cards fluttering to the ground like defeated flags. Then, someone off stage cut the feed, Not with a dramatic closing, but a desperate yank of the power cable, plunging millions of homes into sudden, jarring silence. But it was already too late. The fire had started. Within minutes, the footage of Jasmine unfolding the Vatican letter, of the sealed documents and grainy photographs spread across the polished oak table, flooded every corner of the internet. Someone had recorded the live feed on a phone. Someone had uploaded it, and now it spread like wildfire, no force on earth fast enough to cage it back. On Twitter, hashtags ignited with the fury of 1,000 storms. Pure, silent, no more, Chosa the letter, Chihur the shadow, and the light within an hour. The silent truth was trending in 23 countries. Major news outlets scrambled to catch up, their polished anchors hurriedly discarding the evening's original scripts in favor of frantic live coverage. CNN broke into its primetime broadcast with a flashing red, breaking news banner, the familiar voices now uncertain, almost trembling, as they tried to summarize what they had just witnessed. BBC aired a full replay of the segment within 45 minutes, cutting their previously scheduled royal family special without apology. Reuters, Associated Press, and Al Jazeera unleashed teams of analysts and investigators, pouring through every frame of the leaked footage, dissecting Jasmine's words line by line. In living rooms, airports, college dormitories, bars, and church halls around the world, people stopped whatever they were doing to watch, rewatch, and argue over what it meant. Some saw betrayal, some saw salvation. But no one, absolutely no one, could look away. In the first 3 hours, responses from the church hierarchy began to trickle out. Statements hastily drafted, cold and impersonal, aimed more at quelling panic than at offering any real answers. These accusations are unfounded. The church remains committed to transparency and truth. Documents obtained outside of authorized channels cannot be verified. But the words felt hollow, brittle, breaking apart under the sheer gravity of what Jasmine had exposed. For every official denial, a new voice rose up online. Former seminary students, disillusioned parishioners, journalists long blacklisted by Vatican officials. One by one, they began sharing their own fragments of the story. Photographs, invoices, letters, hints that they too had seen cracks in the marble long before tonight. The dam was breaking, and there would be no way to patch it now. By midnight, spontaneous gatherings formed across major cities. In New York's Union Square, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, many holding candles, some holding signs that simply read, "Faith survives truth." In Paris, a silent march wound its way along the Seine, the only sound the soft ripple of banners in the cold night air. In Rome itself, barely a mile from the Vatican walls, crowds gathered at Piazza San Pietro, their faces illuminated by the soft, unwavering glow of phone screens replaying Jasmine's broadcasts again and again. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't a protest, it was something quieter and therefore infinitely more dangerous. It was the moment when silence stopped meaning obedience. Inside the Vatican, the reaction was swift and panicked. An emergency meeting of the College of Cardinals was convened behind locked doors. Security forces doubled around St. Peter's Square, their dark silhouettes sharp against the ancient marble. Radios crackling with coded instructions. Leaks from within the Vatican began slipping almost immediately. Whispers of old alliances fracturing, of young clerics refusing to toe the line, of secret investigations quietly reopened after years of forced dormancy. At one point, just before dawn, an unconfirmed internal memo surfaced, posted anonymously to encrypted forums, spread like a virus among journalists. It read simply, "The house divided cannot stand. The light is breaking through." Meanwhile, Jasmine sat alone in a rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the glare of television cameras or the roar of crowds. The television in the corner of the room blinked with endless coverage, panels of experts shouting over one another, clumsy headlines flashing across the bottom of the screen. The footage of her standing under the studio lights, reading the Vatican letter, played on a loop, punctuated by endless slow-motion close-ups, her hand cracking the wax seal, her voice cutting through the breathless silence, her face unreadable, yet burning with something that no editing could ever erase. She didn't watch the TV. Instead, Jasmine sat by the window, the battered folder resting on her lap, her fingers tracing the folds and creases worn into it by years of fear. In the distance, over the city skyline, the first gray streaks of dawn clawed at the horizon. She knew the fire had been lit. She knew it would rage beyond her control now, and she knew the next battle would not be fought on a talk show stage. It would be fought in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the shadowed corridors of power where the true architects of silence would now turn their full attention to stopping her. But it didn't matter anymore. She had done what needed to be done. For the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett allowed herself to close her eyes, not in defeat, but in a hard, battered kind of peace. The truth was out, and it would either save them or burn them all to the ground. The marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace had always been cold, but tonight they seemed to hum with something colder still: fear. Beneath the gilded ceilings and endless mosaics, the true heart of Vatican power was convulsing. Word of Jasmine Crockett's broadcast had spread faster than even the oldest among them thought possible, shattering the careful scaffolding of silence built over decades. In the papal apartments, the glow of television screens cast harsh reflections onto ancient portraits, their painted saints staring blindly down at a new reality they could neither bless nor avert. A conclave was summoned in the dead of night. Not the sacred ceremonial kind, but something far more urgent and ruthless. Cardinals in crimson robes moved quickly down the hidden hallways, their whispers sharp as knives. By the time the emergency council convened, the tension was so thick it seemed almost physical, clinging to the air like smoke after a battlefield cannonade. Rows of grim-faced officials filed into the great hall, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old tapestries, now dulled with dust and secrecy. Security was doubled, Swiss guards in full regalia flanking every entrance, their halberds ceremonial in appearance but deadly in training. The Cardinal's Secretary of State stood at the head of the long table, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the polished wood. No prayers were offered to begin the session. There were no benedictions, only the low murmur of a world collapsing under its own lies. They knew what was coming, and for the first time in living memory, they did not know how to stop it. The first order of business was containment. Within hours, carefully crafted statements were dispatched to every major media outlet across the globe. The Church categorically denies the authenticity of the documents presented. No credible evidence supports the allegations made. The Holy See remains committed to transparency, accountability, and service to the faithful. But the language felt hollow even as it was spoken. It was the language of institutions too large to imagine their own death, desperately applying old bandages to wounds now gushing far beyond their control. Inside the room, arguments flared. One faction, mostly younger, reformist clerics, urged transparency, real investigations, a reckoning long overdue. "If we do not act," one brave Monsignor said, voice trembling, "they will tear it down for us." But his words were met with glares sharpened by decades of palace intrigue. The older faction, the careerists, the architects of silence, had no intention of surrendering the citadel they had spent their lives fortifying. "We survived Luther," one cardinal snapped. "We will survive a political actress on a talk show." The room buzzed with uneasy agreement, but deep down, even the most cynical among them felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Because this time, it was different. This time, there were receipts. By dawn, internal directives were issued to every diocese, monastery, and affiliated institution worldwide. Discredit the source. Question the validity of the documents. Frame the event as an attack on faith itself. Invoke history, persecution, martyrdom, righteous endurance. Within 12 hours, carefully selected voices, bishops, theologians, media allies, began appearing on news channels, radio programs, op-ed pages. They spoke not of the evidence itself, but of Jasmine's character, her supposed political motivations, the dangers of weaponized misinformation. A cardinal with decades of media experience delivered a solemn televised address, invoking the memory of saints who had suffered for truth, twisting the narrative into one of victimhood for the institution rather than for the people it had betrayed. But even as the machine roared into motion, cracks appeared. Behind closed doors, Vatican financial officers frantically pored over archives, shredding documents, rerouting accounts, severing digital trails that might link offshore holdings to high offices. At least two mid-level administrators disappeared entirely, their offices found empty, personal effects hastily abandoned. And worse, whispers began circulating among the lower clergy, among seminarians, among the laity. Whispers that the documents were not only real, but incomplete, that there was more, much more. And Jasmine had only shown the first knife. Outside Vatican walls, the world seethed. Investigative reporters swarmed the city like vultures, some flashing press credentials, others bribing janitors and gatekeepers for scraps of access. Rumors of resignations filled the cafes along Via della Conciliazione, blending with the thick scent of espresso and quiet dread. Crowds still gathered in St. Peter's Square, larger now, angrier, bolder, holding candles, holding signs, holding their breath. A homemade banner was hoisted into the air one afternoon by a group of university students. We believed in the light. You worshiped the walls. The Vatican's official radio station tried to downplay the unrest, broadcasting endless streams of choral music, prayers for unity, homilies on forgiveness. But no hymn could drown out the growing roar outside. Because this time the betrayal wasn't hidden behind theological jargon or legal obfuscation. It was printed in black and white. It had faces, it had names, and the faithful could read. Inside the apostolic palace, the old men gathered again as dusk fell, their faces more haggard now, their prayers tighter, tinged with something dangerously close to panic. "We must reclaim the narrative," the Cardinal Secretary of State said, pounding the table with a fist that trembled slightly. "If we do not, we are lost." Proposals filled the air like desperate arrows. Stage a symbolic firing of a few expendable officials. Announce a grand council of reform, months into the future, enough to buy time, not so soon as to require action. Redirect attention, highlight missions of mercy, charitable projects, global peace initiatives. But nothing, not the blood of martyrs, not the gold of centuries, could put the genie back into the bottle. Because now every word they spoke sounded exactly like what it was. The frantic noise of men who knew the walls were crumbling, and the light was coming in, whether they liked it or not. And in a small, forgotten side chapel of the Vatican, where ancient candles flickered against crumbling frescoes, a lone priest knelt long into the night. He was not part of the council. He was not part of the cover-up. He was just a man who had once believed the marble and gold could hold back the darkness. Tears streaked his face as he whispered a prayer, not for the institution, but for the souls betrayed inside it. "Forgive us," he said to the silence. "Forgive us for forgetting what the light was meant to protect." And above him, the candlelight danced wildly across the faded inscription carved centuries earlier into the stone. "Veritas vos liberabit." The truth shall set you free. And somewhere far beyond those heavy walls, Jasmine Crockett watched and waited and prepared for what would come next. Because the Vatican had made its move, and now it was her turn. The night was deeper than black when Jasmine finally turned off the television. The apartment where she had been hiding for the past 2 days sat perched on the edge of the city, surrounded by nothing but the whisper of empty streets and the cold blinking of distant radio towers. The room was dim, lit only by a single battered lamp in the corner and the steady blue pulse of her laptop in sleep mode. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, distant but constant, as if the entire world was on the verge of waking from a nightmare, or plunging deeper into it. Jasmine leaned back in the creaking armchair, the battered folder lying open on her knees. The Vatican letter, the photographs, the evidence no amount of denial could erase. Her phone vibrated again against the tabletop, the screen lighting up with yet another unknown number. She didn't answer. She hadn't answered the last 20 calls either, because Jasmine already knew what they wanted. Some offered her sanctuary, discreet, hidden, quiet. Some offered her money, millions to disappear, to never speak again. And some didn't offer at all. They simply warned. "Leave now, before it's too late." The warnings came dressed as advice, but Jasmine could feel the chill beneath them, the same chill she had felt the night Pope Francis handed her the sealed envelope beneath the olive trees. The wolves had found her scent again, And this time, they wouldn't just watch. A soft knock rattled the apartment door. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent. Jasmine froze, every muscle tensing under her skin like coiled wire. Slowly, she rose to her feet, crossing the worn carpet in bare, silent steps. She didn't speak. She didn't ask who was there. Instead, she checked the security camera feed from her phone, installed by a friend who had insisted after the broadcast. Two men stood outside the door, black jackets, neutral expressions, no badges, no visible weapons. But everything about their posture screamed practiced violence. They weren't here to arrest her. They were here to offer a choice or deliver an ultimatum. Jasmine backed away from the door without a sound, heart hammering against her ribs. They knocked again, softer this time, almost polite. Then silence, long, stretching silence. And then the sound of retreating footsteps. But Jasmine knew better than to think they had truly left. She spent the next hour pacing the apartment, mind racing. Her options were brutally simple: disappear or fight. She could take the escape route offered: the hidden compound in South America, the new identity, the erased past. She could vanish into the fog of history, a martyr whispered about but forgotten when the next scandal drowned the world's attention. Or she could stay. She could stand her ground. She could carry the truth until it crushed her, or until it burned a hole through the darkness wide enough for others to follow. But staying meant war. Staying meant living every second knowing the wolves would circle tighter, closer, more desperate with every breath. It meant sacrifice. It meant betrayal. It meant becoming something more than just the woman who opened a letter. It meant becoming a symbol, and symbols bled more than soldiers. Jasmine closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her so hard she thought her knees might buckle. She thought of Pope Francis, standing alone under the olive trees, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of the battle he could not win alone. She thought of the faces of the audience as she revealed the truth. Some stunned, some furious, some weeping without even knowing why. She thought of the children who would grow up either believing the truth was worth fighting for, or believing silence was the price of survival. And finally, she thought of the shadow, the hooded figure in every photograph, the warning that had haunted her steps for years. You will see the shadow before you see the light. He had not lied. The shadows were here. But maybe, just maybe, so was the light. Dawn began to creep over the skyline, bleeding cold gray light into the corners of the apartment. Jasmine moved to the table where the battered folder lay open. She gathered the documents with careful, steady hands, fitting them back into their protective sleeves. She tucked the photographs into an inner pocket of her coat. The images of the hooded figure, the evidence that could no longer be denied. Then she opened her laptop and began to type. Not a resignation letter, not a farewell, a manifesto, a declaration. She would not hide, she would not be silent, and she would not let them convince the world that silence was the same thing as peace. The words poured out of her faster than she could contain them, each sentence sharp-edged and electric. Faith is not built on marble. It is not protected by silence. It does not survive behind locked doors or in hidden vaults. Faith survives by the courage of those who refuse to bow before the golden idols of power and fear. This is not an attack on the church. It is a call back to its soul. And if speaking the truth means walking into the shadow, then so be it. I would rather stand alone in the light than kneel forever in darkness. When she finished, she hit save, and then sent the document to a carefully curated list of journalists, activists, and clergy she knew she could trust. It would be published, with or without her. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the apartment with a pale, unforgiving light. Jasmine zipped her coat, slinging the old battered folder under her arm. She moved to the door, hand resting on the handle for a moment longer than necessary. On the other side of that door, the battle waited. The men in black jackets, the silent watchers, the agents of fear. But fear, she realized now, was a choice too. And she had already chosen. With a steady breath, Jasmine Crockett opened the door and stepped into the war she had been born to fight. Not as a victim, not as a fugitive, but as the bearer of a light they could not extinguish. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.